of Money with Santosh Sirur.
Hello and welcome to another episode of The Sound of Money. On today's episode, we're going to talk about the recent supply chain management issues that basically the world has been facing. Also, we talk about the credit space, especially given the pandemic and its side effects or the after effects. And to talk about that, we have a very special guest joining on The Sound of Money. We have Ravi Valecha, who is the CEO of India Factoring. And he's got a fantastic experience, almost 20 years plus in banking and finance, in corporate and retail banking. Also, he has been into credit space. And as I mentioned, he's a specialist in factoring and supply chain management. Hi, and welcome to the show, Ravi.
Good morning, Santosh. How are you doing?
All well, all great. Thank you. So, Ravi, my first question to you, factoring, right? It's relatively a new term to a lot of us. So can you just share a little bit more about what exactly is factoring?
Definitely. So factoring, yes, indeed, a new term for people in India and Asia Pacific, but although not a really new term. Factoring and supply chain finance has been there really since, I would say, 1960s or so, or even earlier, but a more developed mechanism of factoring evolved since 1960s itself. So it's more of a relatively easier way of availing financing, not just financing, but other aspects of ease of working capital for especially for the SMEs and the mid corporates. It's nothing very rocket science. It's not as plain vanilla as a working capital finance or a term loan or an overdraft facility, but it's a more you are selling off your receivables to a factoring company or a bank who is buying out the receivables and providing you finance against those receivables. So in a sense, it is more effective solution, not just from a working capital point of view, but also to deleverage and make your balance sheet lean and effective, which is reflected by way of a true sale of receivable through an assignment mechanism. So you're making your balance sheet light, effective. You're converting your debtors into cash at the time of the sale and not carrying any residual exposure also. Factoring goes one step ahead also by way of providing collections from your buyers and also a more effective credit insurance or a credit protection, which is that in case the buyer goes bankrupt or doesn't pay, then the factor is taking that risk of paying you against those receivables also. So in a true sense, it's a three or multi-pronged product, a whole suite of features encompassing not just finance, but also ledger and collections management, and also most importantly, the credit protection element as a whole bucket boutique of services being provided under the ambit of factoring. So that's factoring for you.
That's very interesting to know. Especially it gives a very different a view from especially given the pandemic. I'm sure you guys have been extremely busy with this, and it must have been a very different mindset when the pandemic started. So how did you guys actually start or plan out a strategy, considering the fact that there were a lot, the stock markets were down, we didn't know what was going to happen. There were eventually, would that be NPAs, would there be massive bankruptcies? So how did you guys really plan it out or strategize for 2020 onwards?
So 2020, as you know, it started on a good note, although the emergence of COVID-19 was just taking shape in early part of 2020, but came March and everything went on a shock. So initial shock was there in the entire economy, and so was with us also. We didn't know this was a complete new, unpredictable environment, unprecedented environment for all of us, and including our factoring companies like us. The benefits of factoring, although we have been talking about on paper, we have experienced earlier in earlier downfall in economic crisis like in 2008 also, but this time also, the factoring benefits really came out in the true sense by way of, because factoring is you're financing against the receivables and you're getting your payments from the buyers. So in a sense, you get an early indicators from the buyers if there is any chances of default or delays. You are acting as a most early warning signals. You get it from the economy that what's happening because you're financing the early, actual underlying trade. So it's much better suited, unlike a traditional mode of finance, it gave us the early warnings that what could happen and what could not happen. Fortunately, uh, the regulators across the world and governments across the world brought in several reforms and measures, financial reforms, to help the economy, not just economy, the customers, the overall SMEs or the mid corporates or all the entire users of the financial services, from a retail customers to the corporate customers also. So in a sense, the impact what we would have seen in early or in March 2020 or April 2020, till about October, things settled down, and things which were being perceived as going to be drastic or catastrophic really
Mhm.
didn't really turn out as impactful as it could have been,
Mhm.
because of the several measures, reforms, and impetus being provided to the economy across the world
Yeah.
by all the regulators put together.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
in a sense, we also survived. We held our strength, we held our back, and we emerged in a much better scenario than what we could have anticipated possibly in March or April 2020.
Okay, so now with the new financial year just commencing, and the situation definitely improving, but of course, I'm not talking of the second wave. We don't know whether it's a second wave, and it's really restricted to Maharashtra and adjoining states. Uh, do you get positive signs, positive vibes from the industry, or where is it heading?
See, the backdrop of pandemic is still there. Okay, now although the economy revives in September 2020 onwards, there has been impetus, there has been the pent up demand, or as we call it, but there has been sustained demand being there. There wasn't any demand shock which was there from September onwards. Now, obviously, the second waves, as we saw in Europe, also the second wave and possibly the third wave emerged, and that took a toll. We do see early indications of those instances already in India as well, with the second wave now coming in, gaining full strength.
Hmm.
The impacts of which obviously we need to wait and watch. Although this time people are more prepared because the medical system, they know how to tackle these pandemic. The vaccine is on overdrive. Vaccination drive is
Yeah.
completely going in swing, and that's why it is the impact may not be as strong as what we did see in 2020. But yes, we remain optimistic. The governments are supportive at this point of time. The chances of lockdown seem slim, so
Hmm.
economic impact may be there, yes, definitely, because retail may soon be off limits. Retail having an being off limits, it will
Yeah.
have its cascade impact across the work stream, across the functions and the sectors. So yes, there will be an impact, but how much that impact will be is something which we need to wait and watch. But I don't expect something as big as 2020.
Okay, so let's talk more specifically about the lending space and specifically SMEs lending space. Do you see an uptick there? Is there a demand? Is there, especially, pre-COVID, we all remember how the situation was, especially even industries like automobiles. We do seem to get some good positive signs out there, but SME lending space, that's my first question. And a related question maybe is related to, agriculture or the agrarian economy was not as much impacted in the last year, so that has been a blessing, big time blessing. And even now we get very good reports from the weatherman saying the monsoon could be again really doing good for India. So if these two questions, what are your views or opinions?
No, so I would consider the SMEs as the most resilient of all the entrepreneurs in the world. I have seen in India and across the world also. The
Hmm.
resilience shown by the SMEs is truly worth noting. Just
Hmm.
to give you an example, uh, you would know many of the apparel manufacturers, the likes of the T-shirts and various, and the suppliers to the big names across the world.
Yeah.
Some of them are from India as well. Now, the demand shock was there since March 2020, but come June or so, people or SMEs in particular realized that what is going to help them sustain. And since the underlying material used for apparel, and likewise the necessities which were there from emerging from the pandemic, that is masks or PPE kits and
Yeah.
all. You would be surprised that India was a net importer in March 2020. By June or possibly September 2020, India was a net exporter of all these, that is masks and PPE kits. So from
Awesome.
that point of
Yeah.
view, so that the SMEs are the most resilient lot, and they have shown their intent that yes, when the issue contingencies come up, they are ready to move or pivot, as they call it, change as per the requirement as the emerging situations come in. So they have moved as per those and have stood the times, the vagaries of the times, I would say. Likewise, from an agri point of view, I would say agri, see, food is sustenance, right? So from an agri point of view, the demand going down, and food is, entire agri commodities are classified as an essential commodity. So I would say that even in the worst of the situations, the supply chains and all mattering the agri industry was being taken care of because they form part of the essential sustainable mechanism for the human being.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, the government, the Indian government specifically came up with a lot of SOPs and incentives for across the sectors and more so for the SME. But one part is, of course, the SOPs and the incentives, which is the supply part. But it's again the consumption part, which is also equally important. What is your view on the consumption aspects, which are key to the growth eventually?
Yeah, so you mentioned automobiles earlier in the earlier question. So automobile, just to give you insights from the news items and what's going on in the industry. Since September, there was the resurgence, as they call it, from the automobile side of it. So in the initial month, it was called as a pent up demand. Maybe it sustained to October as well because Diwali was forthcoming in India, biggest festival because of which demand goes high. But the same sustained, the demand sustained. If you were to go into any dealers, any automobile manufacturers, dealers today to buy a car or book a car, you have a waiting period of 3 to 6 months. And that's not because of the supply constraints. That's not really because of the supply constraints. It's really from the point of view of the demand showing higher than what the companies are able to manufacture these goods. So that's from the automobile point of view. And likewise, I have seen that, other industries also showing immense demand being there. For another example, realty, that is the housing and other parts, the government, specifically in Mumbai, Maharashtra, they put in their added focus that yes, this industry was affected to a large extent. So they provided SOPs by way of reducing the stamp duties and taxes from that perspective, almost 50% or so. That saw a huge demand pickup. In fact, the amount of revenue generated by the governments possibly far exceeded the expectation. So that shows that it goes hand in hand. That yes, SOPs are required, but there is a demand which was not being met, and now I don't see a challenge on the demand front. There is enough requirements from the people point of view that the demand will keep up. The supply constraints, there will be some bit of hit, ups and downs. The spikes will come in, but I see that sustainable economy being persistent in India at least.
Absolutely. Very, very positive aspects. Glad to know that. So let's come to another aspect of your industry, and that is supply chain management. And, incidentally, a lot of challenging, situations in the globe. Just in addition to the pandemic, we recently had the Suez Canal issue and also the green seal. So are there any underlying challenges this industry has had, which has never been upfront out there? And, we are seeing that off late. I mean, given the fact that even we have, the China issue where, it started off there, right? And then we had a lot of industry bottlenecks there. Then we had the the automobile industry where there were supply chain issues, and which is why, things were not moving ahead. So do you think supply chain management is something as a discussion point that has not been discussed the way it should have been?
No, so in any financial services world, any financial product which you use, there is a requirement of being meticulous or being prudent about. Okay, now we saw somewhere in 2007-8 when derivatives were being largely introduced in Indian financial services market. they went bad at that point of time because of various reasons, because it got over leveraged or being oversold or being missold. So likewise, in other product areas also, there is a similar requirements to being prudent. Now, supply chain finance also is one of the most interesting and problem resolving solution if it is to be used in a proper manner.
Hmm.
It's how you are using it is important, and whenever anybody goes to abuse it, any product, be it any financial services
Yeah.
product, you may end up, heads down rather. Okay, so in this situation also there was a similar trends being observed. There is a situation where you go too aggressive and possibly over leverage yourself, over task yourself with being not good deep diving into the details. For example, this the mention which the fiasco which you mentioned about financial services in supply chain finance world today is a combination of being over leveraged or being concentrated on particular customers and not deep diving into the background credit insurance aspect of it. Believe me, the devil lies in the detail, as we call it, or as we have learned all through. And when you go aggressive, when things are looking up, there is an over understanding that possibly you may not look into those details as much as you would do in a normal situation or in a difficult situation. So that's being highly optimistic, because of which things were ignored, I would say. But as a general, supply chain finance is a wonderful product, and to each green cell sort of a situation, there are hundreds of other positive aspects to it. The supply chain finance world today is possibly into trillions of dollars, and it is helping the large corporates, enabling ease of finance to the SMEs itself. So what we are talking about today's topic is the how SMEs sustain, and how do we fund those guys? How do we make them ease for working capital? This is what it is all about. It's all about being prudent at the same aspects. Many of these players today, what we see, they ignore certain aspects of the business which are equally important. For example, the due diligence is
Yeah.
likewise very, very important aspects. And when I say due diligence, it's not only about the customer's due diligence, that is your sellers or your borrowers, but also due diligence about all the stakeholders involved in the transaction. It's a trade transaction, right? So any trade transactions, you need to be very, very meticulous about and the entire due diligence aspects from all stakeholders' point of view. And it is equally important that the insurance aspects, which is the key enabler, I would say a risk mitigant, is paid its due respects, and a detailed analysis is carried out of the policies and what wordings are there to avoid any sort of pitfalls which could give rise to such a situation as we have seen.
Okay.
To your second point, which you mentioned about the Suez Canal, and in also another aspect I would point out in the global trade worlds is also about the shortage of containers. Like any a black swan event, the pandemic has turned out to be, it has disarranged the supply chain across the world, affected because supply chains work in a very, very well oiled machinery in the normal situations. Now because of the pandemic, things were not symmetric across the world, right? Some places there was a spike, some places there was a down. So it was not symmetric across the world, because of which it creates a supply chain constraints in various globes. For example, you took an automobile for an instance. Automobile is nothing but a culmination or a consolidation of more than 40,000 odd spare parts, right? Now, even if a one spare part doesn't get reached the OEM, that is the manufacturer or assembler,
Yeah.
the car will be manufactured. Simple.
Yeah.
So the today's world, the supply chain is so well entrenched. Although the manufacturers or the suppliers are located across the world, the supply chain is so well entrenched that it works in a very, very well-oiled machinery. And any small event like what we have seen, in fact, this was the biggest event in our lifetimes. So this has disrupted the supply chain finance, yes, across the world. which is where it created a shortage across various spare parts, various things across the world, and which is why it disrupted the supply chains for various commodities, various sectors all put together.
Okay.
The Suez Canal issue was an added, I would say, double whammy or triple whammy, you can call it, because it was not something it was
Unexpected, yeah, out of blues, yeah.
Yeah. So it is also adding to the issues, but I'm sure that these are periodic hiccups which we continue to see across the world. These are just blips, I would say, in a larger trade environment.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ravi, for sharing your insights into both credit and even the supply chain management industry. That was really very helpful and useful for our audience. So that was Ravi Valecha, CEO of India Factoring, joining us on another episode of The Sound of Money. We can join you back on another episode where we talk about India, the growth story, the macroeconomics, and also, as we all know, we've been talking in a couple of our episodes on financial literacy. All that and more with me, Santosh Sirur, in the coming episodes of The Sound of Money. Thank you and take care.
Sound of Money with Santosh Sirur.